work and appearance by some quirk of fate did not seem suspicious to the capos. There was only one incident like that. I was alone in the workshop, working on the planks. The Obercapo Balke stood a couple of steps behind me, unbeknown to me, and was watching my work for a while. Then he summoned the capo, Walter, identity unknown, and pointing his finger at me slowly uttered, "Wer ist das?" But after that, they left, without disturbing my work. My colleagues, next to whose workstations the capos had been standing, told me about that. Apparently, Balke realized that I was no carpenter. Balke was generally an interesting person in many ways. Tall, handsome, intelligent-looking, rather rigid and cold. On Sundays, when we were being tortured till noon with the so-called Blocksperre, that is, being locked in our barracks and enduring various inspections of uniforms, Balke would come over and take all the carpenters out into the square for an assembly gathering, moving them, dividing them into 20s, appointing the 20 men, and keeping us in the square when the sun was shining and with the orchestra playing in the background. Until the Blocksperre was over. Then he would release us with a smile, happily waving goodbye, and send us back to the block. Our camp was constantly growing. I do not mean the number of prisoners, though. It was always about 5,000 to 6,000 men. The current prisoner number was well over 20,000. Well over 10,000 people have been devoured by the crematorium. The camp was growing in another way. It was expanded. Save for the 8 blocks built in the roll call square, which changed the numbering in the entire lager. And except for the fact that the camp was expanded further in the direction of Industriehof 1, in the main camp itself, the Stammlager, some sub-branches were quickly constructed. The first one, called Buna, was 8 kilometers east of the camp, where a quasi-rubber factory was constructed. The second branch of the main camp, a newly constructed camp, Birkenau, Brzezinka, named after a birch grove, also bearing the name Rajsko, which had nothing to do with Rajsko village. Rajsko was located several kilometers to the west of the village, to the south, and the name was rather ironic. Building both sub-branches of the camp was claiming a great number of human lives. Over 1,000 prisoners would march every day to Buna before the morning roll call. They would get up much earlier than us, coming back a couple of hours after we had already finished our day of labor. In Birkenau, they were only just building barracks, for now, wooden, unspoiled, innocent-looking, new. Not until later did Birkenau Rajsko become the site of infernal scenarios. Carpenters and woodworkers were needed to construct these barracks, and in the absence of woodworkers, they were immediately substituted with carpenters. They worked in the field, in the rain, later in the snow, unter capos rods, as the order was clear. The hell in Rajsko had to be built as soon as possible. Our carpenters were supposed to go there to die. Balke had to supply those carpenters, but was reluctant to do so. He always took his time with it. It was a tough time for the carpenters, but it seemed for him as well. The carpenters who were sent to build cabins in the open fields, and ultimately about 1/3 of all the carpenters were sent there, usually died there, having caught cold or just collapsed from exhaustion. So it was always the inferior professionals who were chosen by Balke. He usually looked at me inquisitively, as if pondering, send him there or not. And somehow he always marched on further to the rest of the carpenters, awaiting their fate, leaving me in the workshop. Only a marginal number of people was ever released from Auschwitz. They were mostly inmates from the street roundups in Warsaw, with no cases on record, who were bought out from the camp by their families through various kinds of middlemen practicing this trade. These middlemen were often blackmailers or charlatans. Some families had the backing of foreign consulates or even private contacts at Sucha Avenue. In the autumn of 1940, about 80 people from the Warsaw consignment were released. In 1941, however, releases were very few and far between, literally only a few prisoners each time till autumn of 1941. Altogether, tens of prisoners. Only in autumn 1941, about 200 prisoners were sent to the Liberty Block, specially dedicated for that purpose. They were kept in quarantine prior to their release. They were provided with better quality food so that their appearance would improve. They were not abused, and those who bore evident signs of having been beaten were kept in the hospital until they fully recovered, so that they would not bear the evidence of the atrocious ill treatment of prisoners in Auschwitz. When one considers, however, that in November 1941 the new prisoners who were brought into the camp were given numbers over 25,000, well, of what consequence was releasing 300 individuals? Each released prisoner was dressed in his civilian clothes, produced from the bags hanging in the Effektenkammer. They also had to go in the company of other inmates who were about to be released as well, or alone, through the wooden cabin behind the gate. This is also where the Postzensurstelle was located. There, an SS man would bid them farewell, reminding them that they were not to say a word about the camp in Auschwitz. If anyone were to ask, how was Auschwitz? They were supposed to say, go and see for yourself. A naive suggestion. Should the German authorities find out about someone's inability to hold his tongue, that man was sure to swiftly turn up in Auschwitz again. This was more convincing, and former prisoners of the camp really remained silent, as if under a spell. The game that I had started in Auschwitz was very dangerous indeed. In fact, this sentence does no justice to reality. I have long since crossed the line of what people on earth call danger. Merely stepping inside the wires at the entrance was dangerous itself. My work here had me absorbed unreservedly, and because it started to develop faster and faster still, I started to worry about my family buying me out of the camp, as was the case with other inmates. Just like them, I had no case, because I was brought here from the street roundup as well. And so, not wanting to expose my work, I had been writing letters to my family, telling them that I was treated really well, and that they should not do anything about my case, that I wanted to stay there till the end. It was up to fate itself whether I was going to leave or not, etc. I received an answer when Janek W., Jan Włodarkiewicz, found out about my whereabouts, tormented by a bad conscience. He kept asking everyone, why did he go there? He retained his integrity, however, and when the family asked him to buy me out, he replied that he had no money for that. I found a way of sending letters to my family, written in Polish. A young friend of mine, 47, identity unknown, was working in town, and it was there that he managed to get in touch with some civilians. These civilians forwarded 2 letters of mine to my family. The letters were then forwarded to headquarters. Out of my first cooperators in Warsaw, here in Auschwitz, save for those whom I have already mentioned at the beginning of 1941, I met Stach, 48, Stanisław Ozimek, who was later moved to the quarries, and in the summer of 1941, Janek, 49, Jan Dangel, whom, as allegedly sick, I successfully managed to put in the transport to Dachau. Dachau, in comparison with Auschwitz, was a much better camp. Because of recurring escape attempts, the camp authorities decided to enforce the policy of collective responsibility since the spring of 1941. For 1 prisoner's escape, 10 prisoners was to be shot dead. Selecting the 10 condemned to death was a tough experience for the camp, especially for the block these victims were to be chosen from. As the organization positioned ourselves in clear opposition to these escapes, we organized none ourselves and condemned every inclination to flee as a manifestation of extreme selfishness until major changes would be introduced in that regard. Up until that point, all the escapes were wildcat acts, unrelated to our organization whatsoever. The death selection would take place just after the roll call, at which the absence of the fugitive was noticed. The camp's commandant with his entourage would show up in front of the block that the fugitive came from, walking in front of the rows of inmates, making a beckoning gesture with his hand in front of the prisoners he liked, or rather did not like. The already inspected row would take 5 steps forward, and the entourage continued the march in front of the next one. Sometimes the commandant picked several inmates from one row, sometimes not even one. The best thing to do was to look death daringly in the face. Those who did so were usually spared. Not everyone could handle the pressure, though. Sometimes someone would try to sneak past the commission to one of the rows that had been already inspected. Those inmates were usually spotted and marked down for death. There was an incident one time when a young inmate, Franciszek Gajowniczek, was chosen to die. An elderly priest, Maximilian Kolbe, took a step forward and asked the camp's commandant to choose him instead and let the young man go unpunished. The entire block was petrified from shock. The commandant agreed. The heroic priest went to meet his death, and the other prisoner fell back into line. The political department worked efficiently, which resulted in people being killed because of their previous records on Earth. The camp's authorities took particular delight in gathering up larger groups of Poles to be gunned down on Polish national holidays. Once upon a time, still out in the normal world, I yearned for creative work, for a chisel, for sculpting. Many a time did I think, well, I never have any time for that. Someone would have to lock me up in a prison. Fate has always been on my side and listened to me, this time as well. I was indeed locked up, so the only thing left to do was start sculpting. But I knew nothing about it. There was a carving shop next to the carpentry workshop. Except for several fine artists, graduates from the academy like 44, Wincenty Gawron, and 45, Stanisław Gutkiewicz, everyone there was a woodcarver, mostly Highlanders. Thanks to 45, Stanisław Gutkiewicz, and 44's Wincenty Gawron's help, I got into the carving shop as well. What made it easier was the fact that the carving shop was a sub-commando of the carpentry workshop where I had worked for a few months. The foreman of the carving shop, 52, Tadeusz Myszkowski, was a good colleague of ours. I showed up there on November 1st, 1941, and made several designs of paper knives. They told me, "It looks splendid on paper, but please transpose this to actual woodwork." And so I started my work, moving permanently to the carving shop. In the first week, I carved 3 knives. The first one was just for practice, to generally familiarize myself with handling the tools. The second was slightly better, and the third one was shown to the carvers by 52, Tadeusz Myszkowski. This is how you should carve knives. And so the work went well. A great fellow, always cheerful, 42, Tadeusz Lech, sat one side of me, and the other, a good colleague, 45, Stanisław Gutkiewicz. In the morning of November 11th, 1941, 42 approached me and said, "I had a weird dream. I feel that they'll blow me away today. Maybe it is a trifle, and yet, if nothing else, it makes me happy that I'll die on November 11th. Half an hour later, his number was read out among others at the morning roll call. He bid me a heartfelt farewell and asked me to tell his mother that he had died in a good spirit. He was dead a couple of hours later. Our work was divided in a way that the news from the world outside the camp delivered to us regularly via the well-established routes was spread all over the camp by a 3-member unit of our organization. One of these members, our unforgettable Wernychora, 50, Jan Mielcarek, wherever he went was surrounded by groups of inmates, and he was constantly uttering optimistic prophecies. He was liked and sought by everyone. The organization was expanding. During my stay in the carving shop, I recruited several friends, 53, Józef Chramostek, and 54, Stefan Gajk, then 55, Mieczysław Wagner, 56, Zbigniew Różak, 57, Edward Ciesielski, 58, Andrzej Marduła. It was not just me who was busy recruiting people. Each 5 expanded on its own among the mass of inmates by virtue of their own industriousness, by finding new routes to various commandos, starting new branches based on their knowledge of the character of prospective new candidates. Everything here was based on mutual trust, solving the problem of leadership in specific interconnected groups. It took the position of leaning on particular leaders, taking each individual's personal merit as the sole criterion. I could not have solved this in any other way. I had to reject all the suggestions from planet Earth. It meant nothing who you used to be. What did matter, however, was to be a real man. In each position of power, to be a man who, at the moment of action, would be able to rally the masses, not with his title, as it would not be known to people, but having kept silent earlier, to rally and inspire the masses once the time was right. Therefore, he must have demonstrated this exceptional activism beforehand and have enough courage to be the one whom his colleagues would gladly follow. Bravery was not the only necessary quality. Inner strength and tact were of vital importance too. A minor observation here. When one was molding and selecting people, it was often those in positions of power who were recruited. A sworn-in room foreman was often helpful later on, providing extra food and sustaining the strength of our members sent to him in need of additional nutrition, even if it meant saving food on some people in his room. But if someone trying to win over a room foreman did not know how to behave, had no tact or willpower to refrain from taking the bowl of extra food for himself, then our efforts were sure to backfire. Usually, though, it was the room foreman himself who would take the initiative after several conversations, provided that the visitor had enough willpower and did not say a word about being hungry, even if his own stomach was crying out for food. Doing things this way ensured that the food received from the room foreman did not disturb constructing the organizational network. Regrettably, there were a couple of individuals who, approaching the newly acquainted room foreman, first and foremost asked for food for themselves. In such cases, there was no chance of solid cooperation. The room foreman would only fill the bowls of those who visited him, and that was it. The breakout of the German Bolshevik War, even though the news was long awaited and greeted by us with great joy, brought only minor changes to the camp. Several SS men were sent to the front. They were replaced with others, older ones. It was only in August 1941 that this new war resonated within the camp, like everything else, with a gruesome echo. The first Bolshevik prisoners of war were brought to Auschwitz. Only officers for now, and put into one room of Block 13, according to new numbering, Block 11. There were over 700 of them, squeezed in that one room so tightly that nobody could even sit. The room was sealed. There were no glass chambers in the camp back then. In the evening of that day, a group of German military men, including officers, arrived. The German commission entered the room, put on gas masks, and threw a few gas canisters into the room at random, while observing the effects of the gas. My fellows, the flaggers, who were delegated to clean the corpses the next day, said that even to them it was a truly ghastly sight. People were so crowded that they had no room to kneel upon dying. Leaning one against another, they clutched each other so tightly, and separating the bodies was quite a challenge. Judging by their uniforms, the gassed victims were all high-ranking Bolshevik officers from different regiments. It was the first test of gas in our camp, prussic acid. I was informed about this by 19, Tadeusz Słowiaczek, who, greatly disturbed, was the first to bring me the news. His intelligence prompted him to foresee the possibility of perhaps other attempts that were yet to come, maybe with the prisoners as their subjects. Back then it seemed quite impossible. In the meantime, we had another delousing at the camp, summer of 1941, after which all the carpenters were put together in Block 3 on the ground floor. We were given beds, as almost the entire camp was getting beds, one block after another. It was yet another opportunity for the beaters and the SS men to shine. The beds had to be made better than back in the cadet school, and so more persecutions, more beatings, more violence. In September, some of the carpenters, including me, were moved to Block 12, new numbering, and in October to Block 25, new numbering, old numbering, 17. It was here on one November morning when, shivering from exposure to chilling winds, slashing me interchangeably with rain and frozen snow, I was struck by a most dreadful view. Over the double wire fence, about 200 steps from me, I saw prisoners grouped, as if it was customary in the camp, in 25s, hundreds, who were being chased by German soldiers and beaten with rifle butts. Long rows of naked people. I counted 800 of them, but the front of the group was already inside the gate of the building, so perhaps several hundreds more could have entered before I walked outside the block. The building these prisoners were entering was the crematorium. They were Bolsheviks, prisoners of war. Later on, I found out that there was over 1,000 of them in total. One can remain naive till one's last breath. Back then, I had presumed that the Germans wanted to give underwear and clothes to these prisoners, but why were they using the crematorium to that end and using up precious time in the factory where our colleagues worked 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, still unable to burn all the incoming bodies of our dead companions? As it turned out, the Bolsheviks were led there precisely for the sake of saving time. They were locked inside. A canister or two of gas was dropped into the chamber from above, and then, still twitching corpses were quickly put on the crematorium's burning grates. Because they failed to prepare enough room in advance for the Bolshevik prisoners of war, they simply burned them, as there was an order to exterminate the Bolsheviks as quickly as possible anyway. Everyone was rushed to erect a fence in the camp. The camp was cramped and packed more tightly as 9 blocks were given to house the Bolshevik prisoners of war. They also prepared the administration, the eradication apparatus. It was announced that those of us who spoke Russian could be offered the position of room foreman or even capos in the camp for Bolshevik POWs. We, as the organization, greeted this project, and those who offered their assistance in murdering POWs with disdain, understanding that the authorities wanted to do this vile work using Polish hands. They built the fence quickly, and the camp for the Bolsheviks was ready. There was a huge sign hanging above the internal gate separating our camps, reading, Kriegsgefangen Englander. Later, it turned out that the Germans, capos and SS men were murdering the Bolshevik prisoners of war just as quickly and efficiently as they murdered us. As 11,400 prisoners of war were brought here at the end of 1941, the number given to me by the camp office, were killed very quickly during the winter months. The exception was a couple of dozen prisoners who had agreed to collaborate wickedly and help in exterminating first their colleagues and later also Poles and prisoners of other nationalities in the Birkenau camp. Another exception was a few hundred people who had accepted the offer to become saboteurs. They were dressed in uniforms, trained and fed, and were later supposed to be dropped behind the Bolshevik troops. They were accommodated in the barracks near the town of Oświęcim. The rest, however, was exterminated by excessive labor, beatings, hunger, and the cold. Sometimes the prisoners were kept out in the cold in front of the block in nothing but their underwear, or even naked, usually in the evening or early in the morning. The Germans would laugh and joke that people from Siberia should fear no cold. We heard the howling of people freezing to death. During this time, our camp relaxed in a sense, since the intensity of murdering us had abated, as all the anger and resources needed to torture and murder people were redirected against the Bolshevik part of the camp. The rail beam, which served as a gong for all the roll calls and gatherings at the beginning of the camp's existence, was replaced with a bell hung between two poles near the kitchen. The bell was brought here from some church. It was adorned with an inscription, Jesus, Mary, Joseph. After a short time, though, it broke. The prisoners said that it could not bear the scenes that unfolded at the camp. A second bell was brought to the camp, and this one broke as well. So yet another bell. A third one was brought. Churches still used to have bells back then, and it was rung with care. This one survived until the end. Yes, indeed, the church bell brought up a great deal of emotion in us. Many a time, standing at the evening roll call, we thought that the evening could have been beautiful, if not for the constant spirit of murder surrounding us. The setting sun was painting the clouds with the most splendid colors when suddenly the siren sounded its shrill shriek, informing all the outposts that they were not allowed to leave the watchtowers of the great Boston Kette, and one of several prisoners were not accounted for at the roll call. To us, it was a menacing augury of 10 people about to be selected for death, or, in any case, a stand-up, during which the biting cold would freeze us to the marrow. Or another time, when we were standing in the honorary assistance of a victim who, with his hands tied, was supposed to be hanged at the gallows in a few moments. All of a sudden, in the silence, the calm, peaceful sound of the bell filled the air. The bell tolled in some remote church far away. It was so close, both to my heart and in terms of physical distance, and yet so remote, because out there on the earth, people were tolling bells. They lived, prayed, sinned, but what meaning did their sins have in comparison with the crimes taking place here? Starting from summer 1941, a new custom was introduced, allegedly regulating admittance to the infirmary. Those inmates who felt so weak that they were not able to go to work when the bell at the morning roll call tolled the signal to form the work commandos, and everyone was running to their work columns. The feeble ones, the ill, the Müsselmänner, were to gather in a group at the square in front of the kitchen. Their strength was inspected by the Pflegers and Lagerkapos, sometimes also by the camp's senior, by pushing them around. Some were taken to the infirmary, others to the Schochnungsblock. Others still, despite their exhaustion, were ordered to go to work in the field and sent to their doom, accompanied by a lively march. Those in the Schochnungsblock and in the infirmary usually did not live much longer either. Having moved to Block 25, November 1941, I was acquainted and came to know better a colleague, 59, Hendrik Bartosz, who later became a good colleague of mine. He was a brave and jolly man. I organized a new 4th Five, which comprised, apart from 59 Hendrik Bartosz, of 60 Stanisław Kazuba and 61 Konstanty Piekarski. In the meantime, 2 senior officers, Colonel 62 Jan Kacz and Lieutenant Colonel 63 Jerzy Zaleski, were brought into the camp among other colleagues. I made Colonel 62 Jan Kacz an offer to join our ranks, to which he agreed and started to work with us. By doing so, I made the first exception, since, as I have already mentioned, up to that point, I was trying to avoid recruiting senior officers imprisoned here under their own real names. However, since the organization was growing in size, my colleagues let me know that keeping my distance from senior officers could potentially spark accusations of excessive ambition. A good opportunity to resolve this matter presented itself. My friend, 59, Hendrik Bartosz, found Colonel 64, Kazimierz Heilmann, imprisoned under a false name and thought by the Germans to be a perfect civilian. I contacted Colonel 64, Kazimierz Heilmann, asked him to support our work, and became his subordinate. Colonel 64 had agreed with my work plan up to that point, and since then we kept working together. At the same time, I introduced inmates 65, identity unknown, and 66, identity unknown, into the organization, and also with 59's Hendrik Bartoszewic's assistants. 67 Czesław Darkowski and 68 Mieczysław Januszewski as well. 68 soon started to be of great benefit to us, having reached the position of a Arbeitsdienst. I've lived to finally see the moment that once seemed to be nothing but an unreachable dream. We organized a political division of our organization. Colleagues who used to be at each other's throats in the same started working in a unison now. These were 69 Roman Rybarski, right wing, 70 Stanisław Dubois, left wing, 71 Jan Mosdorf, right wing, 72 Konstanty Jagiełło, left wing, 73 Piotr Konwacki, right wing, 74 Stanisław Leśkiewicz, left wing, 75 Stefan Niebudek, right wing, and so on. We had a sizable group of our former political partisan activists. Therefore, the Poles had to be shown mountains of Polish corpses every day in order to make them bury the hatchet and agree that there is something bigger at stake here. Agreement and a unified front against a common enemy, we have always had an abundance of these, were more important than differences and the hostile attitudes they used to harbor towards each other back in the normal world. And so, agreement and a unified front were in opposition to what these people had always practiced before. Ceaseless quarrels and altercations in the same. From the group of Colonel 64 Kazimierz Heilmann's acquaintances, I took the oath from 76 Bernard Świerczyna and 77 Zbigniew Ruszczyński, and after that recruited 78, identity unknown, and 79, identity unknown as well. In November 1941, Oberkapo Balke left the carpentry workshop, and Oberkapo Konrad Lang, took his place. Konrad had a good attitude towards Polish carpenters, and he was polite. He loved art, sculpture, and Highlanders, woodcarvers. He had convinced the authorities to separate all the sculptures together with 8 of the best carpenters from several hundred people, along with experts in making artistic caskets, incrustations, and other kinds of woodwork masterpieces. He then moved this artistic elite from Industriehof 1 to the great Tannery, with a gigantic factory chimney and a wooden fence with 4 watchtowers by the town. The tannery housed many commandos of artisans, tailors, shoemakers, locksmiths, painters, blacksmiths, stables with several horses, and the aristocracy of the craftsman community, the well-off tanners. As far as artists go, there was a chamber in there that should be called a real sculpting workshop, as our commando, with a few exceptions, comprised only wood carvers. Here, in this small chamber, Professor Dunikowski, Ksawery Dunikowski, was working along with Janek Machnowski, who was looking after the professor, and our companion Fusek, Alexander Fusek. For a short time, Wicek Gawron had also been assigned there. Each commando had its own capo. Everything was held together in the iron grip of the Obercapo Erich Grinke, a glorified villain, and his second in command, a hot-heated capo, Walter, identity unknown. Our sculpting woodworking artistic commando, as Konrad Lang, our Obercapo of the carpentry workshop, wished us to be perceived, joined this collection of various trades. But Konrad did not anticipate the darker side of moving into the Lederfabrik. It was the realm of Obercapo Erich, who did not recognize any other capo's authority at all. These two types clashed. Konrad, an honest art lover, however naive and not hiding his rapport with Poles, and the insidious, deceitful, foul Erich, feared even by the SS man, as he had some shady dealings with the commandant. He rolled the tannery shop as if it was his own domain, running his homestead and hosting the commandant from time to time. They made some kind of deal on the tanned skins. So it goes without saying, Konrad lost. Our workshops were located in 2 rooms of the factory. Behind a few walls, where the proper tannery was housed, there was a reservoir, occasionally filled with warm water. The reservoir was so big that we could even swim a few meters. When I swam there once, by courtesy of my friend from the tannery, I had the same feeling that I used to have when I was still free. It was a long time indeed since my skin had the opportunity to enjoy a warm bath. All of this was done covertly. To think that a prisoner in Auschwitz could possibly take hot baths, to tell someone that you have been swimming, unbelievable. Konrad once took a swim in the reservoir as well, ignoring the fact that he was taking a bath in the company of Polish inmates. He was not feared, for he never did any wrong to anyone, but some thugs saw this, and the first Meldung was filled against Konrad. In December 1941, we were commandiert to work in the evenings, and worked till 10 p.m., not attending the evening roll calls. We had our hands full with toys, commissioned for our German authorities' children. One evening, a capo, one of Erich's henchmen, came to us with some SS man and talked Konrad into going out with them into the town. Konrad, a prisoner himself, longing for the company of free men, agreed, and the trio, along with an SS man keeping an eye on them, went to the town. An hour later, just as we were about to leave the tannery and go back to the camp, a drunk Konrad entered the tannery. He was followed by some capo and SS man, different from those who had accompanied him into town. These 2 witnessed Konrad patting his favorite craftsman on the head, saying to one of them that he should have been made a capo because he was an excellent worker, and nominating several others as foremen of 20-man teams and capos. That was all that was needed. Konrad was locked in the bunker for a good spell. This is how Eric got rid of the Oberkapo on his premises.